Have a moment myself, so feel free to pick up the pics for that. I'll put them on my website.
Morning, everyone. Good evening, sir. Happy Easter. I am excited that I have a scripture that I spent actually probably more time writing this than I did my Good Friday sermon. So if I don't read it to you all, I feel like I cheated you all out of some real genius stuff here. I'm very, very happy to introduce the Reverend Canon Professor Richard A. Burridge. Now, after his name on his website, there are like, I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He's got like 5 different degrees and like 1 ring for the thumb, too. It's going to be leading us on a wonderful 6-week exploration of determining if you can actually follow Jesus Christ today based on what Jesus says in the Gospels. And being here has been in the works for, the better part of 2 years. Having with us for all of Holy Week and Easter, for me at least, has been a wonderful blessing to have a good friend and colleague alongside for all of the services. You probably ought to know a little bit about this guy. A little bit of context might be helpful as why Richard is exactly the man for the job of leading us through this adult formation series. Now, his website will tell you that Richard is an internationally recognized biblical scholar, which he is, an ethicist, theologian, and social commentator. He has published over a dozen books, several of which he may try to sell you, and you should buy them because they are good, and read them. You will learn.
And I don't want to take them home.
Wow. He's also authored hundreds of other articles and publications. His website says that in 1982, or when I was only 8 years old, he was called to the ordained ministry in the Church of England, and during his career, he's been a schoolmaster, a priest, a university chaplain, academic, a professor, and he served as the Dean of King's College London, the longest serving dean in the history of the institution. He served for over 25 years. His academic CV is over 24 pages long. He's a research fellow in the Department of Theology at the University of Manchester. He's also a visiting professor at my alma mater, Virginia Theological Seminary in Virginia. And he is a research associate in the Department of New Testament at the University of Pretoria, South Africa. He was awarded the 2013 Ratzinger Prize by Pope Francis for his academic scholarship that contributes, as they say, to the life of the world church. And he was the first non-Roman Catholic to receive this prestigious prize. And of course, you can read all about all of that on his website. What his website doesn't get into much is that he plays the guitar fairly well. He's a devoted grandfather. And he can work out both his and your golf handicaps while you wait to tee off, mostly in the end determining that you need to give him more strokes than seems reasonably fair. He hangs out with the likes of the boys of the gang from Monty Python and Bono from U2. And he used to hang out with Pope Francis, Desmond Tutu, and Queen Elizabeth. Now he just has to settle for hanging out with King Charles. What you might take for granted, but is absolutely worth saying, is that Richard is a deeply spiritual, devoted disciple of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And he has made it his life's work to help the world know Jesus more intimately, and both challenge what we thought we knew, while inviting us to experience and learn something brand new and important about Jesus and about our own faith. He's a world-class thinker, an excellent teacher, and I'm honored to call him my friend. Please help me in joining with me to welcome Richard first.
Thank you, Matthew. I'll pay you later, or rather let you crucify me at golf this afternoon. It is a joy, an honor, and delight to be here. I'll be saying a little bit about this whole project, but I first started drafting out the ideas for this, and Tim taught it as a master's class at Virginia Seminary in 2009, and he was one of the students.
Look at me now.
And if you want to know why it's taken me 15 years, it's been recovering from some of his questions. Would you please forgive me for sitting down? As you see, this is an Ignatian prayer staff that I got at the Center for Ignatian Spirituality in Ignatius's home in Loyola. But I have a replacement knee and a heart complaint, and I've been on my feet already today. Added to which, we hit a problem with the laptop yesterday. So I'm kind of hoping that it's not going to die on me now, and I'm operating it from here. And I'm very grateful to TJ for running the Zoom. Oh, and I can see that I'm on the Zoom, so that's good. Hello to everybody who's online. Oh, I need to look at that now. Hello to everybody who's looking at the computer doesn't work. Really good to see you. And for the rest of the course, I will be joining you online, mostly from Virginia, but the last week or two from Exeter, where the choir are coming. So that's great. Matthew was asking me to put together some various photographs of me with one or two folk. And so I apologize in advance if this looks like a bit of name dropping, but honestly, they are all there for a purpose. And I do hope that if the people at the back can get some extra chairs or something. But anyway, so this is a course entitled Sex, Money, Power, Violence, and the Meaning of Life. Can we actually follow Jesus today? And I have to say that today's talk is significantly different from the other 4 or 5. So if you can't stand it today, come back next week because it might be a lot better. The point being that today I need to do what I'm calling a method in our madness. Because if we're going to work out how we can understand what the New Testament says about sex, money, power, and violence, we have to have a method. And then for the next 5 weeks, I will be rubbing your nose in sex and money and all of those things, and also in the New Testament. But bear with me today, we have to have a little bit of theory before we get there, but I'm doing my best to make it accessible and palatable. So to let us begin with what one of the things that Matthew was referring to was that in 2014, I had the privilege to spend quite a bit of time with the Pythons who were reforming. They had a massive debt. And one of their friends who was an Eric Idle was very close to a number of rock stars and so on. George Harrison funded The Life of Brian when EMI pulled out. They said, you need to do what we do as rock stars. If you're in debt, you just put a reunion concert together in the O2. And so they booked up one night in the reunion concert, and I was talking with them about it, and we agreed we would have a conference, which we entitled Jesus and Brian, What Did the Pythons Ever Do for Us? Which is a play, if you know the Life of Brian, on What Did the Romans Ever Do for Us? And it was going to be a few days after the reunion gig. The problem was the reunion gig sold out however many thousand the Greenwich Arena holds in half an hour. And they then had to put another 5 nights on, all of which also sold out. So we had to move the conference. But what was really interesting was hosting Jesus and Brian with John Cleese and Terry Jones. Terry Jones directed the movie as well as playing Mandy, Brian's mother. And we had a list of Bible scholars all over the world queuing up to be invited to come and give papers on extraordinary things like the depiction of the crucifixion, or the kind of robes and so on that the Romans were wearing, or the setting of Jerusalem. And I have to say, The Life of Brian is the most historically accurate Jesus movie there is in terms of its setting and all of that. But one evening, I spent an hour and a half interviewing John Cleese and Terry Jones in front of the whole conference. And that whole interview is available on my website. But what was really interesting was that I said to them, well, your original plan, we understand, was that on the night that Holy Grail opened, one of the press called out, what's the next one going to be? And Eric Idle said, oh, looked up, and the next door premiere was Patton, Lust for Glory. So he said, how about Jesus Christ, Lust for Glory? And then because when Holy Grail did very well, they decided that it would be a good idea to make another movie. So they got together and they all said, let's do Eric's Jesus Christ, Lust for Glory. We can really offend everybody if we do that. And they went off and spent a month or 6 weeks reading the Gospels. And as one of my friends who's professor of the Dead Sea Scrolls was even most say, because they said we went and read all the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they all came back and said, we can't make fun of Jesus. He is actually saying an awful lot of sensible things we didn't know he used to say, because all we do is disagree with what the church keeps saying. But actually, they said what we'll have to do is make a movie of somebody who, and the whole of Judea at the time was full of would-be messiahs. And their view was that Jesus was one of the great moral teachers of the human race, along with Socrates and Buddha, Martin Luther King, the winner of American Idol or whatever. And the real target of their movie was the way people follow messiahs, and the way they ignore what the messiahs are saying. So they end up, splitting and fighting with one another, and so on. And so we discussed their idea of Jesus as a moral teacher, and they also wanted to say, I mean, if you watch the interview with John Cleese and then Bishop Southwark when the film came out in 1979, John Cleese got very angry with them. He said, "There's some amazing stuff in the Gospels. Why did nobody tell us that at school?" And they said, "This is the New Testament is a book of ethical teaching which they wanted to respect." However, with my greatest respect to those two dear friends, and you can see here me and John are having a good old ding dong about it, there are problems with both those views. The idea that Jesus is a moral teacher and the idea that the Bible is a book of ethics. Let me explain. When I was Dean of King's College London, I did an awful lot of work in ethics, particularly we had a major international war studies department. We were also one of the only two places in the country which was allowed to experiment with live stem cells and doing stem cell research. And I would meet with the people who were doing that research on a regular basis, and they would say, "Richard, we think we might be able to do this, but should we do this? Can you take us through the ethics of it, please?" And on the way across the bridge to those meetings on the other side of the Thames, something odd never happened. Because Jesus tells us that when you meet a Roman legionary, you should carry their pack an extra mile. I went backwards and forwards over Waterloo Bridge in central London every day for 25 years. I never met a Roman legionary who wanted me to carry his pack. One of the other major ethical issues in the New Testament is the difficulty of meat offered to idols. It comes up throughout Paul's letters in the book of Revelation and so on. I have to say that in the British supermarkets, and from my experience in Trader Joe and Jewel also, is when I look at the labeling of the food, it does not say warning offered to idols. But in the ancient world, all life was sacred, and it's not just true of Jews, but also of the Greeks and the Romans, and later, as you know, of Arabs and Muslims and so on. The slaughtering or taking of life, the shedding of blood, has to be done by priests, a ritual. So if you wanted to buy meat, there weren't butcher shops. You went to the back of the temple where animals had been sacrificed, and that's where you bought your meat from. And that's why you have kosher or halal, if you know those things, still there. So the only meat you could get was meat that had been ritually sacrificed at the back of the temple. But the early Christians were saying, "Oh, this has been offered to Zeus or whoever. Can we eat it?" But like the legionary, this is not a problem that I face on my day-to-day life, but it's a major ethical problem in the New Testament. So the key question is, how do we bridge the gap between the first century concerns, like carrying the legionary's pack or not eating meat offered to idols, and our topics, which are like nuclear war or same-sex issues or abortion or IVF treatment, high finance, embryo research, euthanasia. These are all the things that as an ethicist people were asking me about. And when I go to the Bible, there's not a whole lot in the Bible about stem cell research or nuclear war. And so apparently this is the little bridge that you have over here. I have had the privilege, I have cycled over that bridge, which is taking your life in your hands, I can tell you. But how do we get from one side, i.e. the 21st century, to the other side of this gap? So both these points are actually not true. I'm going to tell you that Jesus is not a moral teacher, and the Bible is not a book of ethics. They are genre mistakes. Now, I want to see who smiles or laughs when I do the next bit. When I say, I, re I really like, sorry, I really like the restaurant at the end of the universe. Hands up those who think they know what I'm talking about. There's a few hands going up there. The rest of you may be a bit confused, and you may be thinking, well, I wonder what's on the menu, or I wonder how you get there. The problem is that the restaurant at the end of the universe is actually a book. It is the second volume of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy trilogy, which has 5 volumes in that trilogy. And Arthur C. Clarke once said to me, after he wrote the 4th volume of the Space Odyssey series, I think a trilogy should never have more than 4 volumes. And I think he was having a go at Douglas Adams. The point is that if I talk about the restaurant in the universe, and those of you put their hands up, you all know I'm talking about a book. The rest of you are going to get very confused because you quite reasonably might think I'm talking about a restaurant. And this is called genre criticism. We have to know what it is we're talking about, because otherwise you're going to ask all sorts of questions about the restaurant in the universe, which I can't answer because I'm talking about a book, not a restaurant. And so when I say these are genre mistakes, I say Jesus is not a moral teacher. He is more of a preacher and a prophet standing in the Old Testament prophetic tradition. There are plenty of moral, ethical teachers in the ancient world, Plato, Socrates, even Buddha, and so on. And what they're interested in doing is giving their teachings. They're not interested in having disciples, and they're certainly not talking about themselves. Whereas Jesus stands in that tradition of Old Testament prophets and preachers and so on. So yes, I'm not saying he doesn't have lots of ethics, and we'll come to that. But that is not his genre identification, being a moral teacher. Equally, I want to say that the New Testament is not a book of ethics. It's a library. It contains 27 books. If you have the Old Testament as well, according to most Protestant versions of it, there are 66 books. Not a single book is written in the genre of an ethics treatise or an ethical book. There were plenty of ethical books in the ancient world, and when I was a student at Oxford, I was made to read most of them in the Greek and in the Latin. But the books in the Bible are not ethical books. That doesn't mean they don't have ethical material, but trying to treat them as though they're ethical books and trying to treat Jesus as though he's an ethical teacher is like trying to treat the restaurant at the end of the universe as though it's a restaurant. So the question obviously is, if he's not that, then what is Jesus and what is the Bible? And the Gospels are written in the same genre, going back to the restaurant, as ancient lives. I have built my entire illustrious academic career on what the great theologian Peter Cook called the art of the bleeding obvious. And I ask the damn silly questions which these very clever New Testament scholars never get around to actually asking. Who's Jesus? What are the Gospels? Because Rudolf Bultmann and the great German theologians of the 1920s said the Gospels are not about Jesus. They're really about God the Father, or they're really about the early church, and they're not designed to tell us about Jesus. And I spent 10 years of my life thinking, well, this is very strange, because they sure on earth look to me to be about Jesus. And that's what I always thought until I came to study theology at seminary. And I even counted all the verbs in the Greek text of all the Gospels by hand in the days before computers were used. I was the first person at Oxford to actually try to use a computer on ancient texts. And I demonstrated that about half of the verbs in the Gospels are taken up with the deeds and the words of Jesus. Jesus is the subject of a quarter of the verbs, another somewhere between a fifth and a third are taken up with his words. So Greco-Roman biography is very different from modern biographies. Modern biographies are written after the 19th century. And there were one or two people in the 19th century that we have to take into account. Somebody called Freud, for instance, came up with the idea that actually how we're brought up affects our personality. So any biography has to talk about the childhood and the upbringing. Somebody called Marx came out with political analysis and said you have to locate somebody within their political background. Weber and Durkheim came up with sociological analysis. So modern biographies have to set somebody in all these contexts. The Gospels do not do that. And therefore, Bultmann said the Gospels don't look like biographies. But the mistake he made was to compare them with modern biographies. The Gospels are very like ancient biographies, which also don't look anything like modern biographies. They provide a portrait through the deeds and the words with an extended account of the person's death. They never wrote an ancient life until the person has died, because they might screw it up at the end. And that's why I was talking in my sermon about the farewell speech. Is a very common feature where the hero gives their great teaching. And you see, did they die as they lived? Did they live up to what they'd said? And so the Gospels share the same generic features as the ancient lives. And I use the word bioi or vitae because the word biographia, the writing of a life, does not occur until the 9th century. And so you can't even talk about biography in the ancient world. What they simply called them were lives, bioi in Greek, vitae in Latin. And modern biography is fascinated in personality and individuality. That was not true of the ancients. They were much more interested in how a person was a representative, the wise philosopher, the brave general, the wise and generous king, and so on. And so the Gospels must be interpreted through the primary focus on the life and ministry, teaching and activity, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And about 15 years ago, at the time, not long after I first met Matthew, I was reading a biography of Jesus by somebody called Joseph Ratzinger, who was a very famous German theologian who had written this excellent biography of Jesus. And then, unfortunately, they made him Pope. And as Pope Benedict, Volume 2 and Volume 3 are nowhere near as good as Volume 1, because Volume 1, he clearly spent a large amount of time in the German libraries and researching, and he just didn't have the time when he was Pope. But he tells a very moving story that when he was a child, he was conscripted into the Hitler Youth at the age of 10, 11, 12. And he was 13 or 14 when the Second World War ended. And he and his brother went to seminary where they started to learn the German theology and so on. And he said, the figure of Jesus on whom everything depends disappeared into the mist. And I was left with the Christ of the church. And I thought, this is the ultra-conservative Catholic Pope saying everything depends on Jesus. I mean, he sounds like a Southern Baptist. And it was extraordinary. And he was saying that the theology is where I'd lost Jesus for him. And that was my experience as a classicist starting to. And so I did this PhD on what are the Gospels to disagree with literally the rest of the academic world when it came out in 1992. By 2013, I was awarded, as Matthew said, the Ratzinger Prize, which the Catholics set up because there's no Nobel Prize for theology, by Pope Francis. I was meant to be debating with Ratzinger. He had just literally stepped down. Pope Francis was living in the rooms in the guest house where I was staying, the room above me, and I had breakfast and dinner and prayed with him most days. It was really interesting. But basically, there was this, he was very new. He cut down, as he did a fantastic job, cutting through a lot of the flummery and ritual that was going on in the Vatican. But he'd only been Pope. And there was this long and involved ceremony, and he made a big speech about how wonderful Ratzinger was. And then basically he made a speech saying, why the hell are we giving this Anglican heretic our top prize? That was basically my understanding. I mean, that was my understanding of his Italian was still heavily Argentinian accented. But that was what and he called upon Cardinal Ruini, who was the chair, like the Nobel Prize, they have a research committee that makes the decision, and they come up with a citation. And he basically looked at Cardinal Rini, and Rini stood up and gave a long speech about it, and it was basically said, because he proved the Gospels are all about Jesus. And I swear I heard Pope Francis say under his breath, I thought I already knew that. But what they actually said in that was that I had established the indissoluble connection of Jesus and the Gospels, and here I am giving Francis a copy of the book. You can see at the bottom, the little book, Four Gospels, One Jesus, which was a more popular book that I wrote after I wrote the PhD, because my friends all said, well done, Richard. You've spent 10 years of your life. You're never going to get back counting all the verbs in the Gospels, writing a 300-page PhD book, which then in its second edition became a 400-page book, and now in its 25th anniversary, it's still going. 25 is 500 plus pages. Yawn, yawn. What difference does it make to actually how we, and I was at seminary with people who were going to be spending their ministry as vicars and rectors, how we can teach our people. It's all right for you, you're going to go off and work in universities, but what about us? And so this is the So What book, as I tried to think of how could I get the basic point across. And I thought of those four images you can see here on the left-hand front cover of the first English edition: the human face, the lion, the ox, and the eagle. These four symbols of the four Gospels. And they were very quickly applied to the Gospels. And Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon in the 2nd century, when challenged by the pagans, why do we have four Gospels? He said, well, there are four corners of the earth, and there are four winds, and there are the four covenants God made with people. And you think, the argument's getting a bit thin here, Irenaeus, you know. But they became really important in the early British church and the Celtic church. And as you can see in this beautiful 12th century Psalter that is on the SBCK Classic Edition, that made me feel like a Ford Mustang or something when they brought out a Classic Edition. There's Jesus in the middle, and there's the four symbols in the four corners. And I researched into how they were used in the Celtic illustrated manuscripts, which were designed for a non-literate people who didn't read. And this is the American 2nd edition over there, and you can see on its front cover it has the pages from the Lindisfarne Gospels, where the four evangelists are sitting there writing their scroll, and hovering above them is their winged symbol. So the Mark has a winged lion hovering over him with a completed book in his paws, and he is inspiring Mark as he writes, and the same for the others and so on. And this is the window of the east window of the church where I served for 20 years in London, which shows again the one Jesus standing over the mystical rivers and the earth, with the four evangelists with their scrolls and their four symbols. And what I tried to suggest was that Mark's picture of Jesus is like a lion, roaring and rushing around, very much like Aslan. Matthew's Jesus, which is the human face, is the teacher of Israel, explaining it all. Luke's Jesus is an ox, a carrier of burdens. He is concerned for the poor, the marginalized, the women, the non-Jews, the Samaritans, and so on. And John's Jesus is the high-flying, all-seeing eagle who is in communion and so on with God. And there are a couple of copies on the book table, and you can also be able to order them from my publishers in the weeks to come. So given all of that Jesus is not a moral teacher, the New Testament is not a set of ethics. The four Gospels are biographies in the ancient sense. How can we use them for the issues of money, sex, power, violence? How can they help us get over that bridge? So this is just one academic. I'm going to do one academic article and one academic book. The original version the longer version of this lecture has lots and lots of footnotes, which I'm going to spare you. But James Gustafson in 1970 wrote an extraordinary article called "The Varieties of Material, the Place of Scripture in Christian Ethics, a Methodological Study." And there I'll give you the footnote to the journal called Interpretation, volume 24, 1970, and look at pages 430 to 450. 55, and there will be a little test on it later. 430 to 455. I taught that to you 15 years ago. I hope you haven't forgotten it.
Or read it.
And what he said is that the Gospels and the Scriptures contain 4 types of ethical material. The first he called revealed morality, which is Scripture as moral law to be obeyed or disobeyed. Thou shalt not. Do you know that there are 365 thou shalt nots in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Jewish law, one for every day of the year? Isn't that great? Don't you just love it? And there's 257 thou shalts. So there's 617 thou shalts or thou shalt nots in the first 5 books of the Bible. So that's pretty clear ethics, because you either you do commit adultery or you don't commit adultery. You know, it's not difficult to work it out. Then there are moral ideals, and that is something to which something like love. I mean, it's much more difficult to know whether you're doing it or not. It's an ideal that we strive towards, but we may fall short. And then there's analogy, because a large lot of it is stories. We're looking at the actions of the judge, right or wrong, in similar circumstances. So, you know, David watching Bathsheba having a bath and then getting her husband killed is an interesting story, but it's basically there to tell us this is not a good idea. You know, just because he was king, you don't follow what he did. So these are analogies of things to do or not to do that are in the stories. And then his last one was a bit more complicated. He was still working out a witness to a variety of moral values, moral norms, and principles through many different kinds of biblical literature. And I have to say, the next 25 years were people responding to this fourfold division, and in particular trying to work out what the fourth one might be. And I'm going to skip over 25 years of scholarship to my dear friend Richard Hayes, who sadly died a few months ago, wrote this book called The Moral Vision of the New Testament, which was a wonderful book. I dialogued with it a lot. I always used to say, and when I was teaching Matthew and so on, I remember saying Richard Hayes is the best book until mine comes out. Richard Hayes takes those 4 types, says, okay, there are rules, direct commandments or direct prohibition. Thou shalt and thou shalt not. Actually, there's surprisingly few direct commands on the lips of Jesus in the Gospels. And that's why if you want to see Jesus as a moral teacher or think it's a moral book, you're going to end up with not very much material. Then he says there are the principles, like love, like liberation, like self-sacrifice. And I like this word, there are paradigms. There are stories of accounts of exemplary conduct or negative paradigms. Just think of Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan, and he ends by saying, go and do likewise. Now, so we have a command at the end of the story, but the story is giving us the example that we should follow. And then the last one, he says, is an overall symbolic worldview of the biblical worldview through which we interpret reality. And he rightly insists that New Testament texts must be granted authority or not in the mode in which they speak. And I prefer the word genre, but what he's trying to say is he's listened to far too many sermons, for instance, about the rich young ruler being told to sell everything and come and follow, where the preacher will say, well, of course, Jesus doesn't actually need us to do all of that. This is a problem that the rich young ruler had. Let's get to the principle behind the story, which is this was blocking his relationship with Jesus. What is it that's blocking your relationship with Jesus? Sort that out, but that means you can keep your bank account. And in other words, as he said, uncongenial rules, like sell everything, should not be avoided by trying to find a different underlying principle. What's stopping you know Jesus? And something that happens to an individual person shouldn't necessarily be turned into general rules. Okay? So, the amalgamated list from all of that is obeying rules and commands, looking for principles or universal values, looking for examples and paradigms, or embracing an overall symbolic biblical worldview. And I was working when Richard came out with it on this attempt to do a New Testament ethics, which was going to be in two halves, where the first half was going to be about the ethical material found in the New Testament. So the ethics of Jesus, the ethics of Paul, the ethics of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and so on. And overall, I was trying to take the fact that the New Testament is not a book of ethics, but has ethical material in it, seriously. And that came out in 2007. And in 2009, I had sketched out the second volume, which was going to be called, first one was Imitating Jesus. The second volume was going to be called Following Jesus. And certain bright young things in my class, including young Hannesian, said, Richard, the subtitle was Money, Sex, Power, Violence, and the Meaning of Life, because I wanted to look at how the New Testament gets used in those topics. And they said, you'll sell a lot more books if you call it Money, Sex, Power, Violence, than if you call it Following Jesus. And I'm still trying to finish the book. And Matthew is going to kill me, and so will the Dean President of Virginia Seminary. They will not let me go back to the UK if I haven't finished writing this damn book before I go home. What's wrong with it? And what I'm trying to do is to take Jesus seriously as a preacher and a prophet of what we call restoration eschatology, the idea that the end is coming when God is going to restore everything, rather than another moral teacher like Buddha or Socrates, which means his ethical teaching cannot be abstracted from his primary concern, which is to preach the kingdom of God. Ethicists, philosophers, want to be obeyed. Jesus wants to be followed. And he is looking for a response from his hearers of one of following him. And this project also takes seriously the Gospels as ancient biography. Because if you just look for ethical instructions, all you're going to get is Jesus' commands. How do you take the rest of it into part? And how do you particularly take the fact that we have all Jesus' actions? And what can we learn morally from Jesus' actions? And Luke begins his second volume, Acts, by saying, in the first book, I wrote all about what Jesus began to do and to teach, words and deeds. And it is also a place where we need to include the people who are not like us, which is why I think TJ's initiative with the Braver Angels is so good. And we'll come back to that, I hope, if we ever get to the end of this. But I need to speed up. So can we get from New Testament ethics to today's dilemmas, bridging the gap? Most New Testament ethicists never get through to today. And then most of them don't have anything much to say about Jesus either. I love the fact that Wayne Meeks, who's written these two brilliant books, says, I don't have a chapter on the ethics of Jesus. It is elusive. In other words, I can't work out what he was saying. And it's beside the point. What I'm going to do is describe the moral world of the first Christian. And he describes himself as an ethnographer, i.e., somebody who makes an account of a people and so on. And that's why it's the moral world of the first Christians, or the origins of Christian morality. But like this drawing, his bridge is not anchored at either end, either in the first century or the 21st century. It's a really interesting account of the early church, but it's absolutely no use whatsoever in helping us bridge the gap. And then if we are going to establish Newton's moral vision, where do we start? And I grew up in Bristol, where there's the Clifton Suspension Bridge, and I used to be amazed by these huge cables sunk into the rock on either side. And when I was at a conference in San Francisco, I went and I looked at these incredible cables that are anchoring the Golden Gate Bridge, going deep, deep into the rock on both sides. And so where do you put the cables in the New Testament or in the first century? And surprisingly, most New Testament ethicists do not have anything about a chapter about Jesus. Richard Hayes, in particular, begins with Paul, and it takes him until page 158 before he suddenly says, oh, I wonder why I shouldn't have started with Jesus. And he has a little excursus on the role of the historical Jesus. I want to begin with Jesus because, as Matthew said earlier, Jesus changed my life when I was a student, though I've been a Christian since I was baptized and christened at 6 or 7 weeks, but it just took me 18 years to understand what it meant. I think Jesus is kind of important. I also trained as an archaeologist, and if you want to explain something, you start with the lowest level first. So that is with Jesus. But then, so if the cables are sunk into the deep rock on this side of Jesus, what are they sunk into on the other side? And particularly as you stand from one side, it's awfully difficult to see through the fog to what's going on at the other end of the bridge. And Richard Hayes has his cables rooted in Paul at one end, and at the other end, he deals with moral questions facing particularly North America in the late 20th century: divorce, homosexuality, anti-Semitism, violence, and abortion. And he has a big chapter on each of those contemporary questions. He also has a couple of pages at the end that said, "Oh, I probably should have said something about money, wealth, and possessions, but I haven't got room. So here's the last afterthought." Now, the interesting thing is this gives him a varying amounts of New Testament material to deal with. There's an awful lot of material on violence. There's not much on same-sex issues, and there's nothing on abortion. And yet he has a whole big chapter about it. So that's the problem about looking over from this side of the bridge to the fog on the other side. On the other hand, you do get days like this, where you can't see either side of the bridge. Okay, it's well known, the fog and that. And this is what we call cultural relativism. Everything they say is relative to our culture. If you listen to a preacher who say, they expand the story of one of the Old Testament patriarchs herding their goats and their sheep and their flocks of their concubines and their wives looking for water. And then I thought to myself, isn't that just like you and me? And I sit there and think, well, when was the last time you herded flocks of sheep and goats and piles of concubines looking for water? I mean, how is your experience in the 21st century anything like those people's experience? And so the idea is that they say everything is culturally relative, which means it's relative to the culture. Therefore, we as 21st century people cannot understand the culture of the first century, let alone going back before all of that. And this is a book called The Use and Abuse of the Bible, a study of the Bible in an age of rapid cultural change. I want to let you into a secret. Cultural relativism is culturally relative. It's like, I don't know if you know philosophically, there's a thing called the verification principle about how everything has to be verified. The verification principle is not verifiable in principle. You can't prove the verification principle that tells you have to prove everything. And the reason why I think cultural relativism is culturally relative is that it was written by a bunch of professors in the 1960s at a university. No, it's hard to believe we've got one. I mean, there's a great university in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which I admire enormously. There is something called Cambridge also in East Anglia, but because I went to a decent university, i.e. Oxford, I can't possibly say the C word. What's more, I was at Oxford in the 70s, so I can't understand what Cambridge dons were doing in the 1960s, because what they were doing was relative to their culture in the 1960s in Cambridge. And for me, in Oxford in the 1970s, I couldn't understand it. And so I want to say, actually, their point is that cultural relativism is a product of their own culture and so on. But they are absolutely right. We cannot just read off. Just because it says the word divorce in the New Testament doesn't mean the same as what we think when we're using it today. And bear in mind that, for instance, throughout the earth, women are possessions, and all the rules about having sex with other women have nothing to do with sex. They're to do with property. You are stealing another man's property if you're having sex with that woman, and it's about property, not about sex. Even though, but we read off from that, think, oh, this is a story about sex. No, it's a story about property. And so what I want to do is to start with human moral experiences common to all people that come down through history of the globe, and that is that these issues around money, sexuality, power, violence, the beginning and end of human life, the meaning of life, the value of life, every human culture has made rules or taboos or customs or mores about these topics. They are things that every human culture thinks they're important. How they work it out is different in every culture, and how we confront those issues is different in our culture. But if I start with the topic, rather than ask a 21st century question, if I say, what does the Newton have to say about the whole area of wealth and poverty? What does the Newton have to say about the whole area of war and violence? Then I might start to get somewhere. I really need to speed up. Richard Hayes uses a fourfold method of trying to bring it together. First, he says the descriptive task, a full exegesis, a bringing together of all the relevant texts in the New Testament. Then the synthetic task, how do we put that together? And he uses three lenses, three focal images to do that. Come to that in a minute. What he calls the hermeneutic task, which is the crossing the bridge. And then the pragmatic task is, okay, so what do we do today in the light of all that we've learned? Now, let me explain those four stages, both in Richard's term and in my term, because that is the model we will then be using for the next 5 weeks. And so if this is a bit theoretical, don't worry, you'll get it when we start doing it with money, sex, power, and so on as we go along. So the first stage, said Richard, is exegesis of the relevant text, to which my question is, how do you decide which are the relevant texts? And what if you let one passage, because he has quite a lot of text on violence and divorce, he lets one passage set the tracks to interpret everywhere else? Well, Richard, in that case, is that the biblical view or is it Richard Hayes's view? And what do we do if there aren't many or none? I mean, there's not much about same-sex relationships. There's nothing about abortion. There's nothing about stem cell research. There's nothing about nuclear war. Richard Hayes, in order to deal with homosexuality and abortion, actually crosses over into the Old Testament as well. We can assume that the New Testament would have used the Old Testament. So I don't have any New Testament text, so I'll go and get some Old Testament text. I prefer the image. I live in a seaside town where we had fishing vessels, at least we did until the Spanish fished all our fish. And the idea of a drag net pulling all the fish together up out of the sea. And I want to catch all the verses. So what I do is I look at literally every verse in the New Testament that uses the word money, wealth, poverty, brass, copper, belt, purse. There's 200 verses that actually talk about that. And that gives me a pretty big field to look at. And similarly, there might not be very much about abortion or stem cell research, but there are 200 verses that talk about life. And there are 200 verses that talk about war and violence as well. There's only about 50 verses that talk about marriage and divorce and sexuality, which suggests that the New Testament's priorities are slightly different from our modern one. And this also enables me to collect the deeds as well as the words. Then the trouble is, when I've got these 200 verses, how do I put them together? Well, Richard Hayes' synthetic task brings them together by using three lenses, three focal images to bring into focus of cross, community, and new creation. He gets those from St. Paul, and they work for Paul. They do not work for Jesus. And in one of the debates with Richard, what I did was to reach across and took his glasses off his face. I said, Richard, your glasses bring everything into focus for you, don't they? He said, yeah. I put them on and said, I can't see a damn thing. His glasses made everything fuzzy for me. And I was saying, if you take the glasses from Paul and apply them to Jesus, you end up with sort of fuzzy things. And so this can lead to distortion. My response is to say, as a mathematician originally, I learned how to plot results on a graph, put all the results together and look at the overall trend of where the graph is going. And I love the fact, I mean, mathematicians like New Testament scholars need to get out more. What do you do with a score that's off the line? You say, oops, that doesn't sound right. And that oops stands for out of preference score. In other words, if you've got data that's off the line, how do you handle that? And that led me to this French-Canadian Jesuit called Guillemet. And Guillemet says that we plot all the data to get the general overall trend. And he uses the image of, when you look up at the night sky and you can see the Milky Way. Yes, there's all sorts of stars that are off the line, but there's a very clear line of the Milky Way, which is the axis of the galaxy. And he says, and I think this is an amazing phrase, Jesus does not give directives. That is my point. He's not an ethical instructor. He gives us a direction, not directives, but direction. And so what I then do is to say, okay, we go with Jesus' deeds and words to give us the initial direction, not the necessary directives. And that helps me deal with the genre mistake that he's not a moral teacher giving ethical instructions. But he is a preacher giving us a direction we should travel in, we should follow it. And we can use his deeds and his words and so on. And then we go into the rest of the New Testament and we see how Paul and the others, did they or did they not follow Jesus? And then we can come all the way down through Christian history saying, did we or did we not follow Jesus? Thirdly, then, in the hermeneutic stage, which Richard Hayes likes well known, hermeneutic is not a German professor of New Testament in Bonn. It comes from the Greek god Hermes. Hermes was the messenger who went between the gods and human, and hermeneuo in Greek just means to take a message or to translate. And hermeneutics is how to translate, how to interpret the text. And he keeps Gustafson's 4 genres, and he also brings in tradition, reason, and experience. I use the same, but I can't handle all these long technical terms. I call it the interpretive stage, looking at the 4 genres. And what I did to really get an example on this was to, what delayed the book a long time was that I was very privileged to spend a lot of time in South Africa. Desmond Tutu was an alumnus of King's. I worked in the anti-apartheid movement. I first brought him to England in 1990. And after liberation, I was invited to go to his 65th birthday, in his retirement in Cape Town. And that started a relationship where I would go every year for his birthday. And I used to think the Afrikaners, the Dutch Reformed Church, were obviously neo-Nazi thugs who knew that what they were doing was wrong. When I met Afrikaners, they were wonderful people who prayed, went to church and things like that. And that really bothered me because how did they get it so wrong? So that meant I had to kind of learn Afrikaans and read their study and so on. And very briefly, remember the 4 things? Rules. Rule number 1, be fruitful and multiply. Well, if John Cleese was in the front row, he would say, who are we supposed to multiply with? And so there's a long debate looking at other Bibles and said, okay, whites with whites, browns with browns, blacks with blacks. That's how we obey God's command. Nothing wrong with that as a method. Or principles. God bless them, male and female. Their principle they got from that is that there is a difference that's on the one hand, or between unity and diversity, and that we should respect God's difference by not mixing up all the different races and colours and so on. Douglas Bax, who wrote the book Apartheid is a Heresy, South African, said, yeah, but there is also the Day of Pentecost, where we all hear the words of God in our own language. The Dutch Reformed Church said, right, that means we have to have an Afrikaans-speaking church for the Afrikaners, an English-speaking church for the English, a Xhosa-speaking church for the Xhosa, a Zulu-speaking church for the Zulus, etc. Having separate language churches is biblical. Whereas the other side said, no, surely the whole barrier was that we were breaking down the barriers between the different languages. And then the biblical worldview. Then there's the examples. Now, the paradox is the Exodus story of the people of Israel leaving destruction was the driving force of the settlers of North America and of South Africa. The Dutch settled in Cape Town in South Africa. They were French Huguenots, actually, who were persecuted in Catholic France. They went as refugees across the border into Holland. Some things don't change. The Dutch didn't want all these refugees. They put them on wooden boats and sent them to the colonies. And they prayed all the way around West Africa. Lots of the ships got shipwrecked. They landed in Cape Town. They discovered milk and honey and wine and apples. And they said, praise the Lord, we've come to the promised land. Oh, look, there seem to be other people here. What do we do about that? Well, when the people of Israel got to Israel, they made all the others hewers of wood and so on. And so we must make these people our slaves, and we must not intermarry with them, because that's what the Israelites did. There's nothing wrong with taking that biblical story and putting themselves in the story, except they put themselves in there as the persecuted people of God. Desmond Tutu and Black and liberation theology uses exactly the same story, except that I need to just say that when the British took control of the Cape, we abolished slavery. So the Boers had a great trek in wagon trains, just like you had across the States, up into the interior to the Gauteng, where they discovered gold and so on. And on the 16th of December, 1838, 500 Boers defeated 20,000 Zulus at the Battle of Blood River. That's clearly a miracle. That's clearly God on our side. That makes us the chosen people of God. The fact that we had guns and they didn't has got nothing to do with it whatsoever. But South Africa formed, that was its national day, right up until 1994 when Mandela became president. And literally, they all gathered and they did the same ceremony from the book of Deuteronomy. We'll choose you this day. We will serve our God. We are the chosen people of the Southern Hemisphere. Except Desmond Tutu also took that story. But for him, the oppressors, so the Dutch, the oppressors had been the French Catholics or the Brits. But for Tutu and co, the oppressors were the Afrikaners. And they were the chosen people who were struggling through to the promised land. It's the same story, the same method. Put yourself in the story, completely different results. One is the Afrikaners are the chosen people. The other is that the blacks are the chosen people. And Desmond was accused of atheism, to which his response was, which Bible are they reading? And in 1982, he was Secretary General of the South African Council of Churches, and he was accused of atheism and communism, and there was a formal investigation. And his response is an incredible Bible study about God's relationship with character. So that was when I was working really. That was the last time I saw him. It was his 88th birthday, just before lockdown and COVID, and I wasn't able to be there when he died, which is a great shame. But I have subsequently been to his grave and so on. And I'm wearing there one of the South African clerical shirts that was a gift from the Archbishop of Cape Town, and I hope you like this one, who I'm wearing in your honour today. So nearly there, folks. So then, lastly, how do we apply it today? This where Hayes applies it to his issues. My interpretation is to say we need an inclusive community that interpret the text. What made me realize this was going to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Matthew said I was chaplain to my golf club. And for a long time, my golf club would not admit women into the golf club. Funny enough, the committee were all men who decided they didn't want women in the golf club. Equally, the House of Bishops, which were all elderly white men in pointy hats, did not want women in their golf club. I mean, in the House of Bishops. And it is therefore no surprise to me that white Afrikaner men read the Bible in a way that benefits white Afrikaner men. Well, my goodness, isn't that a surprise? The whole point about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was that freedom fighters and terrorists, depending on what you wanted to call them, security people or fascist oppressors, black, white, brown, had to sit down and listen to one another and listen to the consequences of the evil things that they were doing to each other. And it was, I mean, the tears that we shed was incredible. And in the middle of that, one of the Dutch Reformed Church dominees, which is like a bishop, stood up and said for the very first time, the church, i.e. his church, has urged seriously with the biblical foundation of the forced segregation of people. We have taught our people wrongly with regard to apartheid as a biblical instruction. Incredibly moving. The question I asked is, this was a very devout, Bible-reading, spirit-guided, worshipping church who came up with that. What are the ideas that our church takes for granted and thinks are so obvious today that might look just as silly in 25 or 50 years' time? And so it's in this last stage that we bring together the human ethical dilemmas, and it's important you have a community of different people. Afrikaners had to sit down with non-Afrikaners, the bishops had to sit down with women, whites have to sit down with blacks, and so on, including the people you disagree with, and especially to listen to the views of those who disagree with you. So in conclusion, although Jesus is not a moral teacher, and although the Bible is not a book of ethics, there is an extraordinary coherence in Jesus' teaching and his example. I also find it very interesting how little of that the church has actually accepted and put into practice through history. Just look at the questions about poverty and non-violence. And I've asked myself also the question, why have certain topics, hot button topics like homosexuality or abortion, become the acid test of whether you're a Christian or not? And people will tell you when you go to elections, you should vote for this person because he's anti-abortion or something, as though that was the only Christian topic. Whereas all these other issues like violence and money are not followed. And so I'm offering you this fourfold method as a way of trying to bridge that gap to get from our world to the first century world, where Jesus is not a moral teacher, he's not an ethical book, but it helps us grapple with decent ethics. And then I always end this with this question: how do we form inclusive communities of interpretation in real life churches and congregations to do comprehensive benefit, which allows for the voice of the other, the person we disagree, to be heard? And then I discovered on your bulletin that in the next couple of weeks, you've got braver angels coming to do 3 weeks for you on civil discourse requires mutual respect and a healthy discussion. And my last slide says, how do we do that in a local church? And my goodness me, Christchurch Winnetka is already doing it. So well done, TJ, and I hope that goes really, really well. So in conclusion, I was privileged at Desmond's 80th birthday to be one of the 30 people, along with Jimmy Carter, Kofi Annan, the Dalai Lama, to write about Desmond. And one of the other people who also wrote about Desmond, we were the only two that were able to get to the book launch. And this is the other guy, and you might recognize him. He runs a little small four-piece Irish band called U2. At Desmond's 80th birthday, he stood up unaccompanied in Cape Town Cathedral and sang "I Still Haven't Thought Where I'm Looking For." And then some gospel choir came in behind him, and I said, "Okay, you're a rock star. I've seen you do that in Wembley Stadium with the rest of the band and amplified, but if you can do it without a microphone and fill the cathedral, you're a rock star." But the other, and he talked about how he'd learned to pray from Desmond Tutu. It was amazing. But his other big thing is, I will follow. And that's what I'm trying to leave you with, the idea that we are meant to be following Jesus. And Bono and I wish you every blessing on your journey through money, sex, power, violence, meaning life. Can you actually follow Jesus today? And to help you, there are a whole bunch of my books on the bookstore. That's the wrong slide, because I did do one where we have dollar conversions. And when those are sold, I'll be providing you with an Amazon list. Is somebody going to ask if there are any questions? Or
Well, first, can we give them a round of applause? Thank you, Chad. Do we have any questions?
I'm sorry, I overshot my time.
I know.
Again.
Yeah.
Oh, Gary. Yeah, they're on the bookstore there, Gary.
This group of fire.
They pay me. But unfortunately, I brought my credit card reader, which doesn't work over here. So if people can pay me in dollars or cash, that would be very helpful. And then when they've all gone, you can get them on Amazon. But there is a free one there for you because you took me out to buy me beer. Yeah, it's the one here. It says Gary on it.
I was concerned about your very early statement about you didn't know about Jesus, but you knew about when the church taught you about.
That was Pope Benedict.
Okay.
Yeah.
That seems profound to me that we know that.
Yeah.
If it's you know,
Right. It was because they were pushing the figure of Jesus out into the mist, and you're left with the exalted Christ that we worship, but the humble carpenter who went around teaching and so on.
concept of human Christ is saying telling us the same thing. But right, yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to start by the bookstore.
Okay.
Yes.
If somebody can rush away, and I know we have something like